After the success of the last video, which were the best games of the season, I guess I've decided to do the 4 worst games of the season in my opinion, and there was only about 4 that I could really find that I thought stood out as absolute stinkers, and so here they are. Remember, these are my opinion. Gold Coast vs North Melbourne in round 6. Gold Coast opened the scoring in the first 2 minutes and kicked the first 3. We could clearly see the Kangaroos just didn't even want to be there. The effort was extremely lacking and a poor showing right from the start. After a very slow first quarter, the Suns were up at quarter time by 19 points. The second quarter saw both teams kick 3 goals, and the only exciting thing to see all game was Curtis evade his defender and set his teammate up for a goal. At the halftime break, the Suns were up by 21 points. The third quarter was no better. The skills of both teams were on full display after some extremely poor quality football. The Roos kicked 2 behinds this quarter, and in turn the Suns took their lead out to 41 points. And in the fourth quarter, after a rest, the Roos defence was caught lacking yet again and just showed lack of effort. The Roos kicked a couple of goals late to make the scoreboard look a little bit more respectable before the Suns responded to kick a couple of their own to win the game by 43 points. Overall, this game was played in front of a huge crowd of 9,672 spectators and probably 3 people on Fox Footy. This was just extremely poor. The skills of the Suns were okay, but the Roos were absolutely dreadful. It was extremely hard to watch because it only looked like one team wanted to be there and the Roos just, I don't know what happened. They just didn't want to be there. They didn't show any sort of drive, passion or want for the footy, and in the end the scoreboard reflected this pretty badly. Overall, it was just an extremely poor showing of footy. My second worst game of the year was Gold Coast vs Richmond round 7. King opens the account for Gold Coast in the first quarter. Poor kicking skills were on show for both teams, and the Gold Coast Suns made the Tigers pay. It took a kick before quarter time to get their first goal. At quarter time, the Suns were up by just 2 points. Poor skills yet again let the Tigers down. It cost them a goal in the first minute of the second quarter. Brendan Ellis is always happy to kick a goal against his old side. After a very boring quarter, the Suns lead the Tigers by 5 points at the halftime break. In the third quarter, the Tigers kicked 2 goals 2, while the Suns were able to kick 6 goals 1. Overall, this was the only quarter in the whole game that was actually watchable, as the Suns extended their lead to 28 points at the end of the third quarter. At the start of the fourth, it almost looked as if there was going to be a Tiger resurgence, but unfortunately it fell short. Their poor accuracy really cost them in this game. The umpiring was quite poor in my opinion as well, and the game was just a massive turnover fest. The game was a very hard watch. If Richmond were able to kick straight, it could have been a lot better and a lot closer game, but the clangers and the atmosphere of the game were absolutely dreadful and just made the game feel completely dead and one of the hardest games to watch on TV during the year. And unfortunately, the number 1 worst game of the 2023 AFL season was North Melbourne vs St Kilda in round 8. The first quarter started extremely slow for both teams, and it took both teams until 4 minutes left in the first quarter to kick the very first goal. This was a pretty clear indication of what was going to come for the rest of the game in front of 22,000 poor souls that were there to watch. At the end of the first quarter, the Saints were 1 goal 6 and the Roos were 0 goals 4. Definitely a primetime Sunday game. Teammates lacking communication caused a terrible turnover, and then Zohar cannot finish an absolute sitter, and again with 4 minutes left in the second quarter, the Saints kick their second goal. Zohar was the only player trying to will his team forward for the North Melbourne Kangaroos, and it just seemed basically at that half time the game was pretty much done. So at the halftime siren, Darcy Tucker has the chance to kick the Roos' first goal for the night. Yes, you heard that correctly, just before halftime, and unfortunately he cannot convert. At the halftime break, the Saints were 3 goals 9 and the Roos were 0 goals 7 behinds. Absolutely terrible scoring for both teams, but the Saints couldn't put them away. They were only 3 goals ahead. It wasn't until 3 minutes into the second half that the Roos kicked their very first goal at Marvel Stadium. The roof can close, and it was dry. Just terrible footy. Lucky kicks 2 goals in a row for the Roos, and honestly somehow keeps the Roos in the game at this point. Sinclair follows up with a settler for the Saints, but Larkey wasn't done yet. He kicks his third for the quarter, and at the end of the third, the Roos have somewhat fought back, but are still down further than what they were at half time. The Roos were down now by 26 at the end of the third. The fourth quarter, Philippou had a contender for Mark of the Year, and when the siren finally went, I'm sure most people were pretty relieved that it was finally over, and the Saints won by 30 points as North had 4 goals 10 and the Saints were 8 goals 16. Both teams were extremely poor use of the footy, and a professional team to have 0 goals 7 at the halftime is just absurd in this day and age when it's not extremely wet. Overall, this game was extremely hard to watch, and I think this takes the cake for the worst game of the 2023 AFL season. Thanks for watching.